The electronic signature on the PDF document glowed stark white against my phone screen, but the timestamp made my chest tighten. It was dated for 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon. At that exact hour, I had been unconscious in a surgical ward, losing the baby my husband and I had prayed for. The recovery room smelled like harsh iodine and stale apple juice. A thin hospital gown crinkled against the plastic mattress as I shifted my weight, trying to ease the hollow ache in my stomach. I gripped the phone so hard the cold metal edges bit into my palm, forcing myself to stare at the document again. It was a collateral certification pledging agricultural land to secure a $5 million credit facility, and as a 39-year-old records clerk at the Prairie County Register of Deeds, I knew exactly what I was looking at. More importantly, I knew I had never signed this one. A sharp burst of laughter erupted from my phone speaker. I switched tabs, opening the live stream of the Rootrise Agricultural Startup launch. "Enjoy poverty, Rachel," Eric said into the microphone. My husband stood on a brightly lit stage inside the county exhibition hall. Beside him stood Chelsea Boone, his young founder and mistress, smiling brightly. Eric was using our broken marriage as a punchline. He told the wealthy investors in the audience that I was a wife who lacked vision and he had to leave me behind. He failed to mention he had just drained our joint account of $240,000 to fund this very event. My husband also did not know my secret, blindly assuming I was just a low-level county clerk. The man had absolutely no idea I was the protector of the Whitmore Agricultural Trust. Behind Eric, a massive digital display flashed with a green status bar. It read, "Funding scheduled." Eric smiled at his mother Patricia, who sat in the front row. The wealthy owner of Dalton Auction and Realty nodded in pride. My phone vibrated in my hand. An email appeared from Samuel Pierce, our corporate trustee. The message was short: "Emergency fraud hold accepted." I watched the live stream closely. On the stage behind Eric, the bright green words flickered. The screen went black for a second, and when the text reappeared, the letters were glaring red. "Facility suspended." The laughter in the hall died instantly. Eric turned around, his face going completely pale. He tapped his microphone and began stammering apologies about a technical glitch. Patricia stood up immediately. She marched to the edge of the stage and hissed at Eric to log into the portal to reconfirm the collateral package. Eric pulled out his tablet. His hands were shaking as he clicked the final confirmation, officially swearing all signatures were valid. He did it voluntarily, and in that moment, he sealed his own fate. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open. Agent Ortiz walked in, flanked by federal investigators. The team did not shout or draw weapons. They simply marched down the center aisle holding their warrants. Ortiz stepped onto the stage and ordered Eric to step away from his device. My husband scrambled, swiping frantically to delete his messaging applications, but a federal agent grabbed his wrist. Chelsea pulled a spare microphone from the stand. "We are being targeted for disrupting big agriculture," she announced, playing the victim perfectly for her remaining viewers. Before the agents could escort them away, an older man stood up in the third row. Calvin Brooks, a local farmer, held up a crumpled contract. "If you are saving family farms," Calvin yelled, his voice cracking, "why did you foreclose on my brother based on a contract signed 3 months after he died?" The entire hall went dead silent. Patricia stopped moving, and I could tell by the drop of her shoulders that she knew this was no longer just about a suspended credit line. My phone rang. I answered it without taking my eyes off the frozen live stream. "The fraud hold is active," Samuel said softly. "But you cannot speak publicly, Rachel. Your forged signature just gave us the final piece we needed to execute the raid." "What do you mean?" I asked. "Rachel, your signature is not the only forged one," Samuel replied. "We found 3 people who signed contracts after they were already dead." 18 hours before the federal agents walked through the doors of the exhibition hall, the hospital room was completely silent except for the hum of the air conditioner. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to focus on the man standing near the door. Eric stood with his arms crossed, keeping his distance from the recovery bed. My body felt heavy and hollowed out by the surgical procedure that had just taken the child we had spent 3 years hoping for. Eric checked his watch, noting that the startup launch was tomorrow morning, and Chelsea needed him to finalize the presentation. I asked him how we were going to pay the medical bills, reminding him about our joint savings account. My husband did not even look at me when he spoke. casually admitting he had already transferred our entire balance of $240,000 to the business account. Adjusting his jacket, Eric simply stated the money was finally being used for something that could live. I pulled the thin hospital blanket tighter around my shoulders, unable to form a response. The man I married walked over to the small chair in the corner and picked up his overnight bag. He slipped his wedding band off his finger, dropping it onto the plastic tray next to my bed with a hollow clatter. I asked him what I was supposed to do without an emergency fund, and he just laughed, a short, cruel sound. He told me to enjoy poverty, assuming my county clerk's salary would not even cover the rent on our house. Eric truly believed I was penniless. He had no idea my mother had passed away 10 months ago, leaving me as the beneficiary and protector of the $100 million Whitmore Agricultural Trust. The wealth was carefully managed by a corporate trustee, meaning I had not received any large cash distributions yet, and my husband never bothered to look past my modest public paycheck. After the door clicked shut behind him, the silence rushed back in. I reached for my phone to call a taxi. An alert popped up on my screen, showing an email sent to my personal address. It was an automated message requesting confirmation of a collateral certification for Rootrise. I opened the attached file, and my own signature stared back at me. The document pledged a massive tract of land belonging to the Whitmore Agricultural Trust as security for a $5 million credit facility. I recognized the slight slant of the letter R immediately. It was a digital copy lifted from the mortgage papers of our old house. I dialed the number for Kansas City, and Samuel Pierce answered on the second ring. The chief compliance officer of the corporate trustee did not deal in emotions, and he certainly did not take orders from a grieving wife. I told him my husband had forged my consent. Samuel asked what authority I had to intervene, speaking in his usual calm, measured tone. I recited the fraud hold clause from memory. Explaining my role as trust protector gave me the right to freeze any transaction involving defective collateral. The attorney paused. He said he needed proof, demanding the original document, my hospital admission records to prove my location, the digital audit trail, and a sworn statement that I had not consented to the pledge. A nurse came in a few minutes later to process my discharge papers. I changed into my street clothes, my hands trembling as I buttoned my shirt. A part of me hesitated. Filing a formal fraud notice would destroy the startup launch, and some small, desperate piece of my heart still wanted Eric to walk back through the door and apologize. I ordered a ride home, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. When I finally walked into our empty living room, I opened a social media application. The first post on my feed was a countdown to the Rootrise launch. The photo showed Eric and Chelsea celebrating with champagne, their lips locked in a deep kiss. The caption thanked him for sacrificing everything for their dream. I did not cry. I walked to the kitchen counter, opened my laptop, and signed the true statement of fraud. I sent the files to Samuel, and he called me back 10 minutes later. He confirmed the corporate trustee would initiate the hold, but his voice sounded unusually tense. He told me their compliance team had actually flagged the Rootrise account 6 months ago for borrower irregularities. He could not share the confidential details of the investigation, but he asked if I had ever come across the names Marisol Vega or Calvin Brooks in my daily work at the county deeds office. I set the phone on speaker. I logged into the public property portal, using my public portal access to search the names. My red date stamp sat next to my keyboard, a constant reminder of my daily habit of checking timelines. I pulled up a mortgage document associated with Marisol Vega, checked the date of the signature, and compared it with the state obituary records. The borrower had signed the contract exactly 3 years after he died. The fluorescent lights in the county records building hummed a low, steady note. I should have been home resting on medical leave, but the silence in my empty house had become suffocating. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the deeds office just as Nora began locking up for the night. My older colleague stopped, her keys jingling in the quiet hall. I told her I only wanted to look at the public access terminals, strictly as a private citizen. Nora warned me that the system logged every keystroke, and any abuse of employee credentials would trigger an automatic review. I nodded and promised to stay out of the restricted directories. I sat down at the corner desk and pulled my red date stamp from my purse. Eric used to mock my obsession with dates, but that simple habit was about to tear his new life apart. I typed Marisol Vega into the search bar and brought up her father's mortgage file. The screen glowed with the electronic signature. Pressing my red stamp onto a piece of scratch paper, I compared the ink date to the state obituary database. 3 years. The man had been dead for 3 full years before someone pressed a digital pen to this contract. Heavy footsteps echoed across the linoleum floor. Marisol Vega marched up to my terminal and slapped a certified death certificate onto the desk. She looked at me with cold, narrowed eyes, demanding to know why the wife of Rootrise's lead strategist was digging into her family history. The angry woman clearly assumed I was gathering intelligence to protect my husband, but I did not defend Eric or even ask for her trust. Instead, I simply slid my own forged collateral document across the desk, watching her defensive posture slowly melt into confusion as she read the false signature. When I asked for a copy of her father's death certificate and a sample of his real handwriting, Marisol handed them over without another word. Another shadow fell across the public counter. Calvin Brooks took off his worn baseball cap, his weathered hands trembling slightly. The older farmer explained that Rootrise had promised to restructure his debt, only to declare a sudden default on a loan he never authorized. He reached into his denim jacket and placed a heavy, rusted gate key on the counter. His lawyers had told him he had to vacate the property by the end of the week. I pushed the key back toward him, shaking my head because I could not take it. Calvin stopped my hand with a gentle, calloused grip. He told me to keep it until I figured out who really owned the place. The rusted metal felt heavy and cold against my palm. Nora walked over with a stack of printed deed transfers. She pointed a manicured finger at the bottom corner of Calvin's file, then tapped the exact same spot on the Vega document. Both pages bore the exact same notary identification number. We ran the sequence through the state licensing portal, and the results made my stomach drop. The credential belonged to a retired notary who had reported her physical stamp stolen 2 years ago, but the police report had mysteriously vanished from the electronic county file. Someone was using a ghost credential to validate dead borrowers. My phone buzzed against the desk. Samuel Pierce had forwarded the digital audit trail I was legally entitled to receive regarding my own forged certification. The metadata attached to the file did not come from an anonymous server. The envelope creator account was registered directly to the Rootrise internal network, specifically tied to Chelsea Boone. My husband and his young founder were not victims of bad data migration. They were manufacturing the loans themselves. A sudden voice echoed from the small television mounted in the lobby waiting area. Patricia Dalton filled the screen, standing outside the county courthouse with a microphone in her face. My mother-in-law wore a pristine white blazer, looking every bit the concerned local business leader. She told the local news anchor that a bitter wife with rich family connections had weaponized federal agents to destroy a startup designed to save struggling farmers. It was the first time anyone in our town had heard about my ties to the Whitmore Trust. The camera panned to a crowd of locals nodding in agreement. Patricia was turning the entire community against me. I turned away from the screen and looked back at my terminal. Nora had just pulled up the historical transfer log for a different farm Rootrise had recently foreclosed on and sold. I expected to see a massive corporate buyer. Instead, the final purchaser was a small holding company. Nora clicked on the registered agent details, and my breath caught in my throat. The official mailing address for the buyer was not a bank or a corporate tower. It was the exact street address of Dalton Auction and Realty. The address on the glowing monitor belonged to my mother-in-law. Nora did not say a word, but her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up 3 more foreclosures from the past year. Marisol leaned over my shoulder as the screen populated with holding companies. They all had different corporate names, but the public records revealed the same post office box and the exact same registered agent. It looked like a dozen separate strings, all tightly knotted around a single wooden post, and that post was Dalton Auction and Realty. I left the county building and drove back to a house that no longer felt like mine. Eric was standing in our bedroom, tossing expensive dress shirts into a leather travel bag. The heavy brass zipper clinked in the quiet room. He paused when I walked in, offering a practiced, exhausted sigh. My husband told me Chelsea was simply misunderstood, softly suggesting my grief over losing our baby had clouded my judgment. He actually offered to unpack his bag and stay, provided I withdraw the formal fraud complaint. I asked him directly about the forged signature on the collateral document. Eric looked away, muttering that he only pushed the papers through to meet a tight deadline. My phone rang before I could respond to his confession. Patricia requested my presence at the local diner down the street, and she made it clear Eric was joining us. 10 minutes later, I slid into a sticky vinyl booth across from the woman who had always viewed me as an unwelcome guest. The air smelled like burnt coffee and old grease. Patricia pushed a crisp cashier check across the table. $240,000. She offered to return our drained savings, provided I sign a non-disparagement agreement and publicly state Eric had merely misunderstood the trust provisions. I stared at the bank logo, realizing the funds were drawn directly from the Dalton auction corporate account. That money was dirty, representing the stolen equity of families like the Vegas and the Brookses. I pushed the slip of paper back across the table. Patricia smiled, revealing a thin, bloodless expression. She told me I had always been nothing more than a lucky clerk who stumbled into an inheritance, and I would never truly belong to the Dalton family. Eric sat completely motionless beside her, staring intently at his coffee cup. He had not chosen his mother out of fear, but because he desperately craved her validation. Patricia leaned forward, resting her heavy diamond rings on the laminated table. "Land belongs to whoever is strong enough to keep it," she whispered. I walked out of the diner and locked myself in my car, needing the quiet space to process the afternoon. Samuel Pierce called an hour later. The corporate trustee had deployed a forensic accountant to trace the collateral fraud, and the preliminary money trail painted a very clear picture. Multiple shell companies were receiving funds directly from Rootrise, and those same entities were paying massive management fees right back to Patricia. My mother-in-law had built the entire maze. Samuel paused, his breathing heavy through the receiver. The accountant had uncovered one more document. It was a private contract executed between the startup and Dalton auction, and the dates made absolutely no sense. I asked him what he meant. Samuel explained the contract scheduled the forced auction of the Brooks farm, but it had been signed 3 weeks before Calvin was ever declared in default. They had scheduled the auction before they invented the debt. The digital copy of the auction agreement arrived in my secure inbox the next morning. Samuel and I reviewed the scanned pages over a quiet phone call, tracing the timeline of the theft. Patricia had signed a binding commitment to sell the Brooks family farm to one of her own shell companies. The date at the top of the page proved the ink had dried 3 weeks before Rootrise ever mailed Calvin a formal notice of default. The entire foreclosure had been a predetermined outcome, though Patricia would likely try to defend it in court as a standard option contract. Scrolling down to the final page of the document, a small detail caught my attention. Every single payment code and calendar entry carried the exact same authorization initials. The letters J.M. sat quietly beside the fraudulent approvals. June Mercer had kept the books at Dalton Auction for 20 years. My mind immediately went back to a recent company holiday party, remembering how the quiet bookkeeper had kept her eyes firmly glued to the floor whenever I walked into the room. Agent Ortiz refused to draw premature conclusions, but June suddenly looked like the perfect accomplice. Patricia did not wait for the federal agents to connect those dots. By noon, she launched her public counterattack. The local news station broadcasted a prepared statement from the Dalton family matriarch. My mother-in-law stood before a podium, weaving a masterful lie about a deceptive heiress. She claimed I had hidden my trust fund, masquerading as a struggling clerk to test her son, only to destroy his startup in a fit of spite when our marriage began to fail. The story contained just enough truth to shift the narrative, and public opinion quickly turned against the vindictive wife. The fallout reached my office within hours. My county supervisor called me into a glass-walled conference room and slid a formal notice across the table. The administration was placing me on paid medical leave, pending a full audit of my computer access logs. They needed to ensure I had not weaponized government databases against my husband. I handed over my employee badge without a fight, refusing to use my corporate lawyers to bully the county. Nora stood by the door with her arms crossed, loudly reminding management that I had only ever used the public portal for my research. Walking back into my empty house felt like stepping into a tomb. I sat on the sofa and opened an audio interview Chelsea had just recorded for a business podcast. The young founder played the victim beautifully, claiming a privileged woman was trying to crush female entrepreneurship. Chelsea blamed the dead borrowers on a simple legacy data migration error. However, the podcast producers had uploaded a behind-the-scenes video of the recording session. In the background of their studio, a Rootrise strategy whiteboard stood in plain sight. Someone had written the words "conversion target" next to a list of local farms. My phone buzzed with an unknown caller identification. Patricia did not bother with pleasantries when I answered the call. The wealthy businesswoman kept her voice remarkably soft, promising that if I did not drop the fraud hold, she would tell the press I staged the federal raid purely to punish Eric for my recent miscarriage. My hand tightened around the phone until my knuckles ached. Agent Ortiz had explicitly warned me that defending myself publicly would cause the real financial architects to destroy their ledgers, so I forced myself to swallow the insult and disconnected the call in silence. A heavy knock at the front door broke my concentration. I walked outside, finding the porch completely empty except for a plain manila envelope resting on the welcome mat. There was no return address. I tore open the thick paper, pulling out a single sheet of printed paper. It was a screenshot of a private text message sent from Patricia directly to Eric. The words proved my husband was never meant to inherit the empire. "Use your own account," the message read. "I need signatures we can afford to lose." Carrying a cardboard box out of the county records building felt like a slow walk to the gallows. A crowd of local residents had gathered near the concrete steps, holding glossy Root Rise promotional flyers. The air was thick and humid, making it hard to breathe as I pushed through the heavy glass doors. Someone in the back shouted the word liar, the sound echoing sharply across the parking lot. A man wearing a worn denim jacket threw a crumpled paper at my feet, muttering that I should be ashamed of myself. I kept my eyes focused on the pavement, gripping the edges of my box until my fingers turned white. Nora walked out right behind me, carrying her own ceramic coffee mug. My older colleague did not give a speech or yell at the angry crowd. She simply stood at my right shoulder, matching my pace step for step, until the group finally backed away. 2 days later, my county supervisor pushed a printed audit log across his polished wooden desk. The internal system review came back completely clean. The digital tracking proved I had never accessed restricted documents, and management officially cleared me to return to work after my medical leave ended. I felt a brief wave of relief, but it faded quickly. An internal human resources memo could not undo a public television broadcast, and my reputation in town remained shattered. I sat in my parked car outside the county office, dialed Agent Ortiz, and begged her to let me release the forged collateral document to the press. I wanted the whole town to see my husband's lies. The federal investigator quickly shut that idea down. Ortiz warned me that if I defended myself by revealing the digital audit trails, Patricia and her bookkeeper would realize exactly what the government had secured. The criminal network would instantly destroy whatever evidence remained hidden in their servers. The choice was agonizing, yet I swallowed my pride and agreed to let the community hate me for a little longer. The suffocating silence did not last long. That evening, Marisol Vega walked directly up to a local news crew broadcasting live outside the Root Rise headquarters. She did not mention the federal raid, and she kept our secret about the internal digital trails. Marisol simply held up her father's certified death certificate right next to a printed foreclosure notice. Looking straight into the camera, she calmly stated that her family had never borrowed a single dime from Eric or Chelsea. Watching her on the evening news, I saw the tide finally begin to turn. One brave victim speaking out gave 3 other farming families the courage to step forward by morning. The doorbell rang just as the morning news segment concluded, bringing a process server to my front porch. The stranger handed me a thick stack of legal documents tied with a rubber band. Eric had officially filed for divorce. His petition demanded half of my assets, claiming I had fraudulently concealed my trust fund during our entire marriage. My attorney reviewed the papers over the phone and assured me that my uncommingled inheritance remained strictly off limits. Furthermore, the lawyer explained that Eric taking our joint savings would be treated as a legal asset dissipation. I stared at the legal jargon printed on the crisp white paper, feeling a deep, hollow ache in my chest. I did not feel victorious. 10 years of marriage had simply been reduced to a spreadsheet of stolen cash and divided property. The ringing of a restricted number pulled me out of my thoughts. I answered the call, instantly hearing shallow, panicked breathing on the other end of the line. A woman spoke quickly, her voice tight with fear. She confessed that the authorization initials in the Dalton auction ledgers belonged to her, but she swore she never issued the commands. June Mercer promised to give me the physical proof, provided I promised never to tell Patricia where she was hiding. The terrified bookkeeper took a ragged breath and delivered the final blow. Patricia did not build Root Rise to save her son, June whispered into the phone. She built it so he would go to prison instead of her. The abandoned feed store on the edge of town smelled like dry rot and decades of spilled grain. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of afternoon sunlight leaking through the cracked roof, creating a thick, hazy atmosphere. Samuel and I stood near a pile of rusted tractor parts, waiting in the heavy silence, while Agent Ortiz remained parked a mile down the dirt road to give us room to talk without triggering an immediate arrest. June Mercer stepped out of the shadows with a lawyer at her side, clutching a thick leather satchel to her chest. The terrified bookkeeper did not waste time making excuses. Looking directly at the dirt floor, June confessed she had skimmed a small amount from the petty cash fund to pay her sick husband's medical bills, and even though she returned the money 3 weeks later, Patricia had found the discrepancy. My mother-in-law weaponized that single mistake, threatening to ruin the older woman if she did not follow every financial directive without question. The quiet confession was a massive relief, untangling the red herring that had made June look like the true mastermind of the entire operation. Reaching into her worn satchel, the accountant pulled out a heavy-bound ledger and a thick stack of printed emails. She explained that Patricia had ordered a complete wipe of the corporate servers last week, but June had secretly buried these physical copies under the floorboards of her family barn. Samuel opened the heavy cover, and we finally saw the raw truth laid out in neat rows of ink. The pages mapped every single payment code directly to the shell companies, tracing the final deposits straight into personal accounts controlled by Patricia. The printed emails were even more damaging, completely destroying any claim of ignorance. I smoothed out a crumpled page and read the printed text messages. "Do not use deceased," Patricia had written to the team. "Write succession pending." Chelsea had replied right underneath, warning them that I might recognize the forged signatures. My own husband had typed the next line, sealing his betrayal in black and white. "She only files papers," Eric wrote. "She does not understand finance." Finally, Patricia delivered the fatal command, explicitly telling Eric to use his own digital profile. "Use your account," the matriarch commanded. "I need signatures we can afford to lose." The evidence did not stop with family betrayal. June handed me a small external drive containing a hidden spreadsheet titled Conversion Targets. Samuel plugged the drive into his laptop, and the screen illuminated a ruthless matrix designed by Chelsea Boone. The young founder had ranked local farms based on equity value, the advanced age of the owners, and their inability to afford legal representation. A column labeled Conversion did not track loan recoveries, but rather marked the exact date the property was slated to be stolen. Clicking a small audio file embedded in the spreadsheet, a saved voice memo began to play through the computer speakers. "We do not make money when they recover," Chelsea's recorded voice stated brightly. "We only scale when they fail." The forensic accountant would not need to dig much deeper, because the ledger clearly detailed Rootrise paying massive fees to Dalton Auction, which then funneled the cash to the shell companies and finally into Patricia's pockets. Eric received small performance bonuses, and Chelsea took founder reimbursements, while the matriarch swallowed the actual land. While we were standing in the dust of the feed store, the fragile alliance at the startup was rapidly collapsing. Later, I would learn exactly what happened in the Rootrise offices that afternoon. Chelsea had been searching through a shared network folder and stumbled across a draft indemnity agreement created by Patricia's personal attorneys. The legal document neatly assigned all compliance failures and criminal liability directly to the founder and the head of strategy. The ambitious young woman finally realized my mother-in-law was planning to keep the real estate empire while tossing her and Eric straight into federal prison. My phone vibrated in my pocket, displaying an unknown caller identification. I stepped away from Samuel and answered the call. Chelsea spoke in a frantic, breathless rush. "I can prove Patricia ordered everything," the mistress said, her voice echoing slightly over the connection. "But I want immunity, money, and a plane out tonight." I gripped the phone tightly, feeling absolutely no sympathy for the woman who had helped destroy my marriage. "I cannot promise you any of those," I replied quietly. "Then I will sell the proof to someone who can," Chelsea shot back. The line went dead. The heavy oak table in Samuel Pierce's conference room felt like a barrier between two different worlds. Chelsea Boone sat on the opposite side, her perfectly styled hair now looking frayed and unwashed. She placed a shattered smartphone and a printed copy of the draft indemnity agreement directly on the polished wood. The young founder demanded a private jet out of the state and blanket immunity from federal prosecution in exchange for the device password. Samuel did not even blink. He adjusted his glasses and calmly explained that corporate trustees do not purchase stolen evidence, and only a federal prosecutor could negotiate immunity agreements. Chelsea let out a ragged breath, her shoulders collapsing in defeat. Patricia had frozen her out of all the corporate bank accounts that morning, leaving the mistress completely broke and desperate. She pushed the phone across the table without another word. My own phone rang later that evening as I stood in my dark kitchen. Eric's name flashed across the screen, and I answered to the sound of shaky, panicked breathing. My husband was sitting in his car outside Dalton Auction, having just confronted his mother about the text message calling us expendable signatures. He told me Patricia did not even bother to deny the betrayal. The woman who raised him simply stated that real power required massive risks, advising him to play the victim and claim Chelsea manipulated the accounts. Eric sounded like a terrified child, crying as he begged me to use the trust to protect him from federal prison. I leaned against the cool granite counter, feeling absolutely nothing for the man weeping on the other end of the line. I asked him a single question. Did you know the startup was using dead people as active borrowers? The line went completely silent. 10 seconds passed. 20 seconds. That heavy, suffocating silence answered the question better than any formal confession. Eric finally choked out a pathetic excuse, claiming he saw one death certificate, but Chelsea promised the legal department had cleared the paperwork. He asked if I still loved him, his voice cracking with desperate hope. I closed my eyes, remembering the cold hospital room and our empty savings account. Love cannot turn a forged signature into a simple misunderstanding, I told him quietly. I refused to ask the judge for any leniency, offering him only one path forward. He needed to surrender his devices, hand over his passwords to my legal team, and tell the federal investigators the truth. Eric walked into the federal building the next morning and handed over his digital life. The encrypted phone provided the ultimate audio recordings of Patricia barking orders, demanding the team use false accounts to hide her tracks. Yet the device also destroyed any chance of Eric playing the innocent victim. Searching through his deleted messages, the forensic team found a specific text my husband had sent to Chelsea. Eric had explicitly chosen Calvin Brooks as their primary target, typing out that the old farmer lacked the funds to survive a protracted legal battle. My husband had knowingly hunted the weakest members of our community, proving he was a willing predator right alongside his mother. Weeks dragged by as the grand jury reviewed the digital evidence and the federal prosecutors finalized the indictments. Law enforcement finally moved on a rainy Tuesday morning. Chelsea and Eric surrendered to federal marshals, trading their designer suits for booking photos and holding cells. Patricia, however, remained sitting comfortably in her massive estate. Her aggressive defense attorneys successfully argued that the evidence against the matriarch remained strictly circumstantial, keeping her free on bail while the legal battles raged on. Agent Ortiz called me just as the local news announced the arrests. The federal investigator did not sound victorious. Her voice carried a sharp edge of warning. Patricia had just executed a massive real estate transfer, moving all the stolen farms into the portfolio of a brand new, seemingly independent buyer. Ortiz explained that if the judge recognized this new company as a bona fide purchaser, Calvin Brooks and the other families might never get their land back, even if my mother-in-law went to prison for the rest of her life. 5 months after the federal raid, I walked into the downtown courthouse carrying the exact same red date stamp my husband used to mock. The grand jury had handed down their indictments weeks ago, and after months of grueling negotiations, Eric and Chelsea had finally signed their cooperation agreements. The heavy mahogany doors of the courtroom swung open, revealing a gallery packed with local farmers waiting for justice. The federal prosecutor did not waste time with theatrical speeches, choosing instead to let the paper trail dismantle every single lie. A massive monitor displayed the certified death certificates right next to the forged loan applications. Next came the digital audit trail from the startup office, followed closely by my own forged collateral certification. When the legal team projected the spreadsheet detailing the conversion targets, a collective gasp rippled through the wooden pews. The raw data proved exactly how the community had been bled dry. June Mercer took the witness stand first, looking frail but remarkably steady. Patricia's expensive defense attorney immediately tried to paint the older woman as an embezzling bookkeeper, but June stripped away their weapon by calmly admitting to her petty cash theft right out of the gate. She looked directly at the jury and presented her backup ledger. Those initials beside the payment codes simply meant she typed the numbers, the bookkeeper explained, pointing a trembling finger toward the defense table. The final approval passwords always belonged to Patricia Dalton. My former husband was called next. Wearing a cheap suit, Eric slumped under the harsh courtroom lights, looking completely defeated. Following the strict terms of his plea agreement, he described exactly how his mother ordered him to use his personal digital account to hide her involvement. Patricia sat perfectly still, her face remaining a mask of cold fury. Eager to destroy his credibility, the defense attorney projected a private text message onto the screen, highlighting the exact moment Eric selected the Brooks family farm for destruction simply because Calvin lacked legal funds. My husband successfully hammered the final nail into his mother's coffin, but the terrible silence in the room confirmed he had permanently destroyed himself in the process. Chelsea Boone approached the stand next, her glamorous founder persona entirely stripped away by the reality of a federal cooperation agreement. When the prosecutor played the audio file recovered from her hidden spreadsheet, Chelsea's own recorded voice echoed against the marble walls, stating they did not make money when farmers recovered, they only scaled when they failed. The young woman simply stared at her hands, finally admitting under oath that the word conversion always meant hostile acquisition. Desperate to salvage their case, the defense team argued that Patricia no longer possessed the land because an independent firm had recently purchased the portfolio. To shatter that final illusion, the forensic accountant returned to the witness stand. Presenting the auction agreement, he showed the jury how my mother-in-law had signed the document 3 weeks before Calvin ever received a notice of default. Furthermore, the financial expert pulled up the registration records for the supposedly legitimate new buyer. This fresh corporation utilized the exact same registered agent, operated from an identical internet address, and survived entirely on bridge funding transferred directly from Dalton Auction. Patricia had simply built another hollow shell. By the end of the week, the jury delivered a swift and absolute verdict. Patricia Dalton was immediately remanded into federal custody, her pristine blazer traded for handcuffs as she was led out the side door. The federal judge ordered a complete freeze on all the stolen properties, initiating the civil forfeiture process. However, the magistrate warned the gallery that returning the physical deeds to individual families would require months of separate civil litigation, bringing the emotional high crashing back down to a frustrating legal reality. Standing on the courthouse steps, the autumn wind biting through my coat, Calvin Brooks approached me. The older farmer asked if the Whitmore Trust planned to purchase the entire portfolio during the upcoming forfeiture sale. Samuel Pierce stood at my elbow, quietly reminding me that a bulk acquisition was the fastest possible way to protect the acreage from corporate developers. I reached into my pocket and wrapped my fingers around the rusted gate key Calvin had given me months ago. If the trust bought the land, I could save everyone. But the transaction would instantly turn me into the most powerful landlord in the county. 3 months passed before we returned to the federal courthouse for the final sentencing, and during that time, Samuel Pierce drafted a dozen different acquisition proposals. My corporate trustee sat across from me in his Kansas City office, laying out a plan for the Whitmore Trust to simply absorb the stolen portfolio. I refused the offer, proposing a different path. We would provide bridge financing to establish a farmer-owned land cooperative instead. The trust would hold a temporary lien while the court corrected the fraudulent deeds. And once the paperwork cleared, we would transfer all voting rights and ownership directly back to the local families. Samuel pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, warning me that this model offered terrible profit margins. Looking out his tall glass window, I reminded the attorney that my inheritance existed to protect the soil, not to maximize my personal empire. The consequences finally arrived in a quiet courtroom on a cold Tuesday morning. Eric stood before the federal judge, wearing a rumpled suit that hung loosely on his shoulders. Because of the overwhelming evidence provided by his own mother and his former mistress, my ex-husband received a sentence of 6 to 9 years in prison, mandatory restitution, and the complete loss of his startup equity. Walking out into the marble hallway, he caught my eye. He stopped near the metal detectors, his voice trembling as he claimed I had completely ruined his life. Meeting his gaze, I felt no anger. I did not ruin anything, I told him softly. I just stopped signing for it. Chelsea Boone faced a similar reality. Despite her cooperation agreement, the young founder received 4 to 6 years behind bars, total asset forfeiture, and a lifetime ban from managing financial institutions. The very next day, a group of local farmers gathered outside the old grain silo and tore down the massive Root Rise promotional banner. The heavy vinyl fell away, uncovering the faded painted sign of the original county agricultural cooperative underneath. Patricia Dalton received the heaviest blow. The judge handed down a staggering sentence of 12 to 18 years, permanently stripping her real estate license and dissolving her entire auction company. During the victim impact statements, Calvin Brooks and Marisol Vega stood shoulder to shoulder, reading aloud the names of every deceased person used in the massive scheme. Patricia sat rigidly at the defense table, finally learning that land does not belong to whoever is strong enough to steal it. The property records prove the dirt belongs to those who never agreed to sell. A few weeks later, I drove my truck down the familiar dirt road leading to the Brooks farm. Calvin was standing near his wooden fence, watching the spring wind sweep across his fields. I walked over and placed the heavy, rusted gate key directly into his weathered palm. The older farmer rubbed his thumb over the metal, quietly asking if the corporate trust had purchased his family home. I shook my head, explaining that we only bought enough time for the federal court to return the deed to its rightful owner. Calvin smiled, turned around, and unlocked his own front gate. My desk at the county records office looks a little different now. Working with Nora and the technology department, we implemented an automated warning system that flags any contract filed after a recorded date of death, or any document utilizing a compromised notary credential. A small wooden box sits next to my monitor, safely holding a faded hospital bracelet. I never threw the plastic band away, yet I refused to let that terrible loss dictate the rest of my future. Picking up a black pen, I signed the final page of my divorce decree. The signature belonged entirely to me. Eric once told me to enjoy poverty. He never understood that the poorest thing in our marriage was the part of me that kept begging to be chosen. I did not need his choice anymore. When you listen to this story, it is easy to get caught up in the satisfaction of the federal raid, the courtroom drama, and the massive trust fund. But the real lesson hidden inside this journey has absolutely nothing to do with $100 million. It is about recognizing the quiet, destructive nature of manipulation and control. People who want to use you, whether they are running a fraudulent real estate empire or sitting across from you at your own kitchen table, thrive by making you feel small. They weaponize your insecurities. They drain your resources, isolate you, and confidently tell you to enjoy your poverty, hoping you will be too terrified to ever fight back. But true wealth is not measured by the balance in a checking account or the name on a property deed. True wealth is your ability to set a boundary. It is the quiet, unbreakable realization that your self-worth is not defined by someone else deciding whether or not you are good enough. You do not need a secret inheritance to take back your power. Your strength comes from refusing to sign your name to their lies. You win the absolute moment you stop begging for a seat at a table that was specifically designed to break you down. Rachel did not destroy her husband or her mother-in-law with her money. She simply stopped protecting them from the heavy consequences of their own choices. Now take a moment to reflect on your own journey. Have you ever stayed in a relationship or a situation where you were made to feel completely worthless, simply because someone convinced you that you had nothing without them? What was the breaking point that finally gave you the courage to draw a hard line and choose yourself? Please share your story in the comments below. Your experience matters, and your words might be the exact key someone else needs to finally unlock their own gate and walk away.